God kvöld og velkommen til dette tredje og sørste online tiltak av KFS. Vi har noen færre. Senest hadde vi en Fyrilestur ved Peter J. Williams om spurningen evangelien og alllandet, og rettelig avhørt Fyrilestur aldri selv. Og han visste så at nekbendra at evangelien og alllandet frasagt om det som hendte i Israel for 2000 år siden. Og som kanskje var særlig vidt i Fyrilestur var at han tog seg en skånd, så var PowerPoint fremdannet førskånd. Og det tog at 18 år gamla døtteren John har tykt alt først. Så man må si at hun er noen av matslige genene til pappaen. Selv om det å gåar også til at halte at evangelien og all denne frasagt om det som hendte, så det her vi at uppreisnin. Det for lengt. Altså det noe som høvendene må ha funnet på. Vi vet alle at de folk ryser ikke opp av grøvene, og her stamper vi en tjattnam i kristne trunne, tog om Jesus ur Nazaret, en søvlig personer, ikke røys opp fra deg, så kristne tryggven likn. Og så alle de første kristne liknar der, og alt faktisk en stor samansvarging. I kveld får jeg sitte nærmere etter Hesson, og jeg får spørre, kunne vi vite om uppreisnin hendte? Og gestor i kveld fyrvandig ateisteren og dropsdetektiven J. Wallace, som 50 år gammal, så började han att läsa evangelierna vid detektivbrillon, och han kom till en öliga ovanliga nyårsdag. Han sa att allt protofärt har bänt jag att Jesus måtte vara risen upp. Det var enasta sannoliga frågegrunningen. Och i kväll kommer det att höra synder om hur han kom till den nyårsdagen. Efter kväll det så först en Fyrilestur på en halvannan timme, och att han tar en lullstäckor, och så handlade det fram vid Q&A eller spurningar och svär. Og til kan sende spurningar inn til telefonnummer 28 75. Og minnes til, eller husker om, at ikke boja for lunch, vi skal spurningar nye. Hvis du boja for lunch, så vant det for at alle spurningar for handler om den sørste parten av Fyrilestur, og til alle det ikke, vi alle kommer rundt i evnen. Til kan sende spurningar inn alle tøyene, under Fyrilestur, under spurningløtene, og til kan skrive førskånd og enskånd, og så takker jeg det herfra. Nå får jeg vite at skifta utlengst. So tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome J. Wallace as our special guest. Hello, James. No, Jim. It's Jim.
Jim's great.
I saw today on a YouTube video it was James Wallace.
So my name is James Warner Wallace.
Welcome to the Faroe Islands.
Yeah. Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah. Did you hear about the Faroe Islands before I wrote an email to you a few weeks ago?
I must confess, I had to go on Google and see where you guys were, because, you're right. I did not know where you guys were located.
Okay.
But I'm just delighted that I can do this remotely. I hope it actually will work. I think it will. Yeah. And the technology allows us to kind of bridge the gap, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, good. I think some of the viewers tonight will be familiar with you from the movie God's Not Dead 2. So are you an actor as well as a cold case detective, or?
Only around my wife on occasion, but that's another story altogether. But no, I'm not an actor. So what they did was, but they put me in a setting that was pretty natural for my experience, where I spent probably way more time in courtrooms than the production team did. So it just felt very natural.
So you've been working as a cold case detective for quite some years, I guess, and for how long? And briefly, what's it like to be a cold case detective?
So cold cases in America are just homicides, because there's a statute of limitations on any other kind of crime. So after a certain number of years, those will close automatically, whether you solve them or not. But homicides stay open. So I started off working homicides, just the fresh, new homicides, and I would kind of pick up an old unsolved case and try to chip at it over time. And then eventually, when I solved one of those old cases, my sergeant said to me, "Hey, let's build a team and actually have a full-time team working cold cases." And I did that for about 10 years. So it was a lot of fun. And those shows end up on TV sometimes. So it's kind of, you're stepping over into two different worlds.
Yeah. So the topic tonight is can we know if the resurrection happened? And the next 30 minutes or so are it's yours. Over to you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna share a screen. So you can see a presentation I've developed for you to kind of understand how I look at it as a detective. I was not a Christian until the age of 35. So I was not raised in a Christian setting. I was a pretty obstinate atheist. But I did become interested in looking at the Gospels at the age of 35. And I'm going to share with you now the approach I took when examining the resurrection. So let me just share that screen now. And here we go. Okay, so I want to start with a story that is a true story that is pretty interesting. It's a story of officers who were dispatched, police officers dispatched to a dead body. We call these dead body reports, okay, DBRs. And on the way to the call, they knew this lady had been a drug user for many years, and they had dealt with her before. And now there's a report that she was dead in her bedroom. When they got to the bedroom, I want to show you what they found. They found this was her nightstand next to her bed. I'll give you a close-up of it. If you look at it here, you can see that there are a number of hypodermic needles. She was a heroin user. She also would smoke raw cocaine, so you'll see there's some cocaine pipes there on her. That's a deadly combination anyway. And so what do you assume that the officers predicted they would find? They assumed this was an overdose. And when they got there, she was dead in her bed, under her covers, and they waited for the coroner's investigator to show up. And about an hour later, when the coroner's investigator showed up, the investigator for the coroner's office pulled down the blankets for the first time and discovered that she wasn't an overdose victim. She had been stabbed to death. So here they were sitting next to a dead body for an hour and never even bothered to pull the covers down because they assumed they knew the answer before they even started. They assumed that this was a dead body, a overdose. And this it raises the question, if you think you know the answer to the question you're investigating before you start, well, there's a good chance you'll miss it, the same way these guys missed it because they thought they knew the answer before they started, okay? Now, what we're trying to do is get to the most reasonable conclusion, the most reasonable inference, because that is the judicial standard. It's not beyond a possible doubt here in America when you're doing a homicide trial. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. But the question is, how would you ever know what is the most reasonable inference from evidence? Well, that's something I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to show you another dead body. Here you go. A dead guy laying face down on the floor. Okay. Now the question is, how do I determine what kind of death this is? Every dead body is not a murder. Some dead bodies are naturally, that happen naturally. So how do we determine what kind of death this is? Well, we make two lists that begin with E. The first list is a list of evidence. The second list is a list of explanations. And what we do is we list the evidence. So far, all we've got is a dead guy laying face down. Well, how do we explain dead guys laying face down? Well, they could die naturally. They could die by some accident. They could have died by way of suicide, or they could have died by homicide. And if I look at this guy right now, all four of these are actually reasonable explanations. He might have had a heart attack. He would look like that. He could have accidentally took too many pills. He would look like that. He could have intentionally taken too many pills. He would look like that. He could have been, choked to death. He would look like that. How do we know which of these four is the most reasonable inference? Well, let's add some information to this. What if instead of just having a dead guy on the ground, we had a dead guy who was laying in a pool of his own blood, center torso? Well, we'd have to add that pool of blood to our list. And now we can begin to cross out explanations because although it's possible this is a natural, he's not bleeding out from his head or his mouth or his ears or his nose. He's bleeding out from somewhere in the center torso area. I don't know how you could do that. I think that you could rule out a natural death. But until I roll him over and see what is the injury, I really can't rule out anything else. So let's go back to our body. What if he's a dead guy laying face down in a pool of his own blood, but now he's got a big knife sticking out of his back? I think that would change things. Let's add the knife to our list. Well, now it's kind of hard to imagine how he could accidentally get that knife in his back. Is it possible? Sure. But it's not reasonable, and that's why I'm crossing it out. We don't care about possible. Our standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you ask me, is something possible, I will always say yes. But I will not always say yes that it's reasonable. Let's go back and look at our I left in suicide because who knows, maybe he could reach out there and do that to himself. And I've seen some crazy suicides, let me tell you. But if he had a multiple stab wounds in his upper back, that would change the dynamic altogether. Now it's really hard to imagine him being able to reach his own upper back that way. I don't think suicide is a reasonable inference anymore. And for example, if in addition to all of this, there were also bloody footprints leading out of the room, well, then you know you have something more than a suicide. Now the most reasonable inference is obviously homicide. By the way, this is my son, Jimmy, who posed for this picture. No one had to die in order to make this presentation, just so you know. Now, I wrote about this in a book called Cold Case Christianity, and I got to draw my own illustrations. So here's the illustration I drew. This is a process of comparing evidence to explanations that is known as abductive reasoning. And we do this in every death scene. We ask jurors to do this in every criminal trial. So when I began to investigate the resurrection of Jesus for the first time as a detective at the age of 35, I knew that this piece of evidence was the most important piece of evidence in the Christian worldview because Paul describes it that way in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, hey, if this isn't right, if this isn't true, we've been lying to you. And there's no hope of a future resurrection of your own. And you've also bought the lie. So I knew I had to investigate one claim of Christianity to really know if the entire system was true. Did Jesus really rise from the grave? Now, I'm going to do the same thing I did in that other death scene. I'm going to make a list of evidence, and I'm going to compare the evidence against the explanations. But what would count as evidence? Well, as an atheist, I would have given you 4 things, and that's all I would have agreed to. I would have agreed that Jesus lived. I'm not a Jesus myther. I don't believe that Jesus was invented. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But I would have said, yeah, he lived, he was crucified, and he was buried. I think there's good historical reason to believe that's true. But so what? You could believe this is true, yet still believe that Christianity is false. Because, there's a lot of people got crucified and were buried back in the day. Also, though, I would have agreed that the tomb was empty. And here's why I agreed to that. Because it seems to me, if you wanted to end this in the 1st century, it wouldn't be hard. Just get the body of Jesus and drag it around town. Or get the disciples to recant. They couldn't do either one of those things. That's why we have this story to begin with. But I still would have said you could believe these 2 things and not think that Christianity is true. I can explain an empty tomb in any number of ways. This could be true, yet Christianity still be false. Also, I would have said that the disciples believed they saw a risen Jesus. So what? All kinds of crazy people believe all kinds of crazy things. And they did seem to be committed to their observations. So what? These 4 things could be true, yet Christianity could still be false. At least that was my belief. And why? Because I had a number of ways of explaining these 4 things. I'll make a list for you. These are the ways I would have explained these 4 things. Now, the last one is just the Christian explanation, but we'll get to that. Now, today we're not going to be able to go through all of these. I'm going to go through a couple, and then I will send you guys a link. I don't think we can do this by telephone because I'm an international call, but I'll send you a link that you can then use, and you can post that, and so you can use to get the entire talk in its entirety. So here we go. I'm going to do a couple of these. Let's start with the first one. Maybe they were just wrong. This is an atheist explanation for the resurrection. I held this explanation for a number of years. Look, if Jesus didn't really die, then you don't have a resurrection, you just have a resuscitation. And that's a very different kind of a claim, right? That could be the case. And so I would say, look, you didn't break the legs of Jesus. You have a passage in Scripture that says when they came to those who were on the cross, executed at the same time as Jesus, they weren't dead. And Jesus may not have been dead. That was my view. Now, they broke the legs of the other 2 guys to make sure they were dead. Well, they didn't break Jesus's legs, so how can you be sure he was dead? All they did was stab this guy in the side, okay? Now, interestingly, John says that when they stabbed Jesus in the side, they saw a sudden flow. John saw, a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, that blood and water, that's interesting to me. You know why? Because it was confusing to the first readers of John's Gospel. As a matter of fact, for hundreds of years, it was confusing. I've read all the church fathers and what they've said about John chapter 19, verse 31 to 34. And they do not think it was really water that came out of his chest. They'll say, no, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of the baptism of Jesus or of water regeneration or the Holy Spirit. And I don't care who you read, if it's Origen or Tertullian or Jerome, none of these guys thought that was real water that came out of the chest of Jesus. Why? Because they didn't understand the science of death. Now, we do understand that science now. And it turns out there's a piece of hidden science in John's gospel. If you've ever been in a car accident or at a situation where someone's been brutally attacked, right before they die, they will go into what's called circulatory shock. And as soon as their heart stops beating, they will go into one of two forms of effusion. One in English is called pericardial effusion, and that is where water builds up around your heart. But it's not as much water you see in this diagram. And so I think if you were to stab that area, you would see really kind of maybe running blood, but it wouldn't look like blood and water unless you happen to be in the right position. So you suffer pleural effusion where water collects in your lung. Now, if you stab the chest cavity, you will see a separation of water and blood. And that's what John saw, even though he had no idea what pleural effusion was. He described it perfectly, but that means that Jesus had already suffered cardiac arrest. Now, I want to share something else about the nature of death that most people do not understand. And that is that, that death has telltale signs. This is the coroner's office in Los Angeles County where all the cop shows will come in and they will, bring in, the bodies go here to be autopsied. And as a detective, I have to go to every autopsy of every murder victim that I investigate. So I've been to a lot of autopsies. Do you realize that in this building in Los Angeles, there is a gift shop? Yeah, there's a gift shop at the coroner's office. You can buy this t-shirt there. Our bodies of work speak for themselves. Or we have this little mouse pad they sell there that says, we're dying for your business. Yeah, believe it or not, there's a gift shop at the coroner's office. But downstairs in the examination rooms, which never look this clean, this is where they do autopsies. And this is where you learn as a detective about what's called the mortis triad. The mortis triad. Now, this is the three things that happen to your body when your heart stops beating. Most of us don't know what death looks like because we don't have to touch dead bodies unless you do this for a living. That's only a few of us. But in the first century, everyone who had to bury their own. You actually worked as a midwife, usually with your to be there for the birth of humans, and you actually had to bury your dead humans. And this was common to everyone in the first century. These people would know the mortis triad, even though most of us don't even think about the mortis triad. This is that happens to you. And this is what would have happened to Jesus after dying on the cross. The first thing is he would have started to cool down, and that is called algor mortis. He would have felt different, and he would not have missed this. People taking his body off the cross, if he's just passed out, he would still be warm. But if he's dead, he's going to start to cool down. The next thing is he's going to start to get stiff, and that is called rigor mortis. And that is a condition that happens when your heart stops beating. And if you've been on the cross waiting for someone to pull you down, your arms will have a tendency to remain outstretched because you're starting to get stiff. Also, you will start to discolor, and this is the biggest giveaway. Wherever gravity draws your blood, that is where you will discolor because now your heart is no longer pumping the blood. So if you die on a cross, your feet will swell and turn purple. It's just the nature of it. You really think people in the first century would have missed this? And by the way, we have that hidden piece of science that shows that separation of blood and water is really pleural effusion. There are many good reasons to infer that Jesus is dead. Is it possible that he didn't die on the cross? Sure. I always say yes, that anything is possible, but it's not reasonable. And that's why I had to cross it off. Now, what if they were just conspiring? I know a lot of people, especially now with COVID-19 and everything that's going on in the world, they love conspiracy theories, right? So many people love conspiracy theories. I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories because I have to investigate them. I know what they require. So this is why if the disciples are lying about the resurrection, well, let me tell you what's required for a successful conspiracy. By the way, if you think you know of a successful conspiracy, it was not successful by definition. So you need these 5 things. The smallest possible number of co-conspirators. 2 people can lie and keep a secret better than 22. You also want to hold it for the shortest possible time span. It's easier to tell a lie and keep a secret for a day than it is for a year. You also need excellent communication because at some point you're going to get separated and people are going to ask you questions outside of each other's presence, and your stories better line up. You better be able to call the other person and say, hey, this is what I told the police. So he can say the same thing. Also, you want strong familial relationships. People don't rat off on their mom usually, or they might, but moms don't rat off on their boys, that's for sure. Also, you want little or no pressure. If no one's asking, you can get away with anything. Now, why is this important? It's important because these are the things that would have had to be present if the Christian story is a conspiracy, a big lie. It's not just the three, favorites of Jesus who told the story, like James, John, and Peter. And it's not even just the 12. Remember, the upper room had 120. And Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that 500 of the brethren saw Jesus alive on the same day. Let's play a little game of Clue. I don't know if you have this game in your country, but this is a very popular game, at least when I was a kid, and it's still popular. And we're going to make our game a little bit different. We'll make the game board will be that area around where Jesus did his ministry, and our game pieces will be the apostles, let's say. So the first part of our new game is going to be, well, how long do these guys have to hold the lie? Remember that shorter is better. Well, it turns out it wasn't just 6 minutes or 6 hours or 6 days or weeks or 6 months or 6 years. It was 6 decades that they escaped. If you told me that upwards of 500 people have to hold the secret for 6 decades, I'm already out. Okay, that's not reasonable. But maybe they have excellent communication. No, they're not in this holy huddle. They're all over the game board. So Thomas, who's in India, has no idea what's happened to the others, and he has no idea what the others are saying about Jesus. Yet everyone's story, even when separated, stays the same. That's interesting to me, even though they're separated by thousands of miles. And are they under pressure? Well, this game involves like murder weapons, right? It's like a detective game. And yeah, we had a show here in America called 24, which was very popular. And the character in this show 24 would basically do whatever it took to get a confession. He would beat that confession out of you if he had to. Well, that's what was happening to these disciples. They were being persecuted and tortured and threatened, and none of them ever changed their story. And are there some brothers here? Yeah, there are a couple of brothers in this set. But Matthew, who's at the bottom of the game board there, Matthew is no one's brother. Matthew wasn't even liked by anybody. Matthew was an outcast, a tax collector named Levi, who joins the group late. He writes one of the first gospels. What's in it for him? Who is he trying to protect? He doesn't even know these guys before he meets Jesus. So I think in the end, this is not a reasonable. It's possible, anything's possible, but it's not reasonable because nobody under that pressure ever changed their story. So I'll just go one more step with you before we take some questions, and we'll go as fast as we can. And that's this last piece, which is that maybe the apostles just hallucinated it. They wanted it so bad that maybe if they're, especially in the one-on-one accounts like Mary Magdalene, she sees Jesus at the tomb and she wants Jesus to be alive. So maybe she just imagined it. And, we got another one here. She did by herself. Another single sighting here where Peter seems to be by himself in Luke 24, 1 Corinthians 15. And he wants Jesus to be alive, and by himself, he could have imagined it. If no one's there to tell him he's wrong. And then you have, James here in 1 Corinthians 15. It says that he was potentially alone when he saw Jesus for the first time, and he probably wanted it to be true. But then you get to Paul. Now, Paul's the only one who sees Jesus on the road to Damascus. But do you really think that Paul wants Jesus to be alive? So that's why he's imagining this? I don't buy it. And not only that, now you get multiple sightings. Like the road to Emmaus, the disciples at Emmaus. There's more than one here. Are you suggesting these people are having the same group hallucination? And then they get the women at the tomb. And you got 3 women at the tomb. Are you suggesting these people are having a group dream? There are no such thing as group dreams. Here we got 7 at the disciples at the sea. These are all separate accounts, very different settings, written by different authors. And so you're telling me that you think these guys, I couldn't even get all of them on the same screen, so I had to add 2 over here. There you go. There's 5, there's 6 and 7. And then you have, remember the upper room, you got no Thomas, you got no Judas, you got 10 here. And so 10 see Jesus. Do you think they're having a group hallucination? There's no record of group hallucinations in this kind of detail. And then, of course, Thomas comes back into the group, and now you have, the 11. So now here's 11. The groups are just getting larger and larger and larger. And here, you don't even know how many are in this group. On the mountaintop, this could be the larger set of disciples. No one really knows, but it's at least the 11. Again, another group that's too large to explain it. Remember the ascension? The ascension has got all kinds of people there at the ascension. But I'll even help you to see that in case you're looking for proof that Jesus is God. I'll give you proof of this right now. Let's have Jesus ascend. Here he goes. There he goes. He's gone. Okay, so now you've got how many left? At least 11. And then finally, we have this account in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul says that there were 500 people still alive, most of them were still alive for the Corinthians to interview, who saw Jesus at the same time. I couldn't even count them all, so I had to add them this way, okay? But look, if you wanted to debunk this as a hallucination, if you thought, no, you guys are imagining this, there's one way to prove to them they are imagining it. Go back to the tomb, because if they're imagining it, there should be a body in the tomb, but there is no body in the tomb, and that means we're back to some form of conspiracy theory, because who stole the body? Here's my point. When Peter says that we're not making up clever stories, he means it, because they aren't making up clever stories. They're simply reporting what they saw. Now, I'm going to skip the last three atheist explanations that I used to hold. They're really important to go through, but we just don't have time today to do that. So I crossed out this one. I crossed out the next three as well. And then I got down to your explanation if you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you think that those reports are just accurate, that the Gospels are accurately telling us what happened. Now, look, every explanation I've ever investigated in a criminal trial, every explanation has strengths and weaknesses. Even the true explanation has strengths and weaknesses, okay, folks? So I would say that your explanation as a Christian, it's got some strengths. I mean, it definitely is the best explanation for those four pieces of evidence we started with. It is the best explanation for these four. There's no doubt about that. But here's the weakness in your explanation as a Christian. Are you ready? And this is what kept me out for so many years. This requires me to believe in a resurrection, a supernatural event. You're asking me to accept as reasonable a supernatural explanation. Are you crazy? Who does that? Who has to go a miracle to believe that that's the explanation? The best explanation is a miracle? Really? Now, but if you stop and think about it, our entire investigation right now is an investigation into this question. Are supernatural events ever reasonable? Now I would have said, no. Don't believe in supernatural stuff. Really? Well, if you take that approach where you think you know the answer before you start, then I can show you something. I can show you some evidence about how early, for example, these accounts appear in history. You will find a way to jump over it because you don't believe in anything supernatural. Well, I can tell you how early it's quoted even by non-Christian authors talk about it. I don't care. I don't believe in resurrections. I don't believe in those kinds of miracles. You'll jump over that. And then I can show you how it's been, elements of the New Testament have been verified. I don't care. I don't believe in miracles. I'm going to jump over that. And then no matter what I show you, you will find a way to jump over it. And the reason why you will find a way to jump over it is because you began there and you refuse to move. And if you're going to take that approach where I start off with the conclusion and I'm not willing to look at any other explanation, well, then you end up right where you started. And this is why when I began this presentation with you today, I started with this table. These officers thought they knew the answer before they started, and they didn't even bother to look at the evidence. They didn't bother to pull down the blanket, and they were wrong about their conclusion. So when it comes to Jesus, we have to ask the question, what happened really? Either he rose from the dead or he did not. Now, if you would have asked me as a non-believer to accept and to look at seriously all explanations, including supernatural ones, because I have to in order to get over there, right? That Jesus rose from the dead. I would have said, I can't do that because I don't believe in the supernatural. I would only consider natural explanations. The problem is these don't work. I've looked at all of them. There are no other options. I've looked at the most recent, I've looked at the most ancient complaints, the most ancient ways to try to get around the resurrection. I would have found a way to hop over all those obstacles to get over to the right because I did not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But look at these two paths. Which of these two paths is least encumbered? Clearly, it's the one to the left. And by the way, the only obstacle on the left, I put it there. I could easily pull that down. Because my bias against the supernatural is my bias against the supernatural. So I could easily pull it down. And if I did, look at how direct the path is to that conclusion. It is by far the most reasonable inference, and the only thing that ever stood between me and the truth of the resurrection was me. Now, I have a website. It's called coldcasechristianity.com. And I don't think that you're going to be able to text this, but for the few of you who might be able to text to get the follow-up resources, I'll give it to you first. You're just going to text this number. I didn't pick this number, so don't make fun of it. It's got a lot of sixes. I get this. This is not good for Christianity, but the number is 66866. And you're going to text one word to that number. The word is the word detective. And when you text that word detective, I'm going to send you a link to this and several of our other talks in their entirety, because we couldn't cover all of this today. And that being said, I think I made my time within about a minute and a half. So I should get credit for that, right? For ending on time. And I'm going to stop sharing that screen and I'll come back to you now. So we can take a little break, I guess, and you can ask any question you want to ask.
Well, thank you, Jim, for a very interesting presentation. Yeah, we will now have a short break, and we will be back in a few minutes. Yeah, welcome back. And Jim, we will jump straight into it with the questions.
Excellent.
And the first question is, if you were an atheist, what led you to examine the Gospels in the first place? What was your original motive?
Okay, so So how it worked for me was I was not raised in a Christian home, and I'm in a huge part of Southern California that has tons of people, and it was very easy to grow up here and never really hang out with Christians. I never had no one ever pressed me really to look at it seriously because my friends that I had were not Christians. And 20 million people in a county like this, we actually can pretty well hide in these little pockets of communities, right? So I had no interest. Now, my wife, though, she was raised kind of in a cultural background in which she believed that God existed. She was aware of the Christian story. But for 18 years that we were together, we never discussed it. I never saw that coming, that she would have an interest until we had kids. And then once we had kids, she was like, oh, should we raise our kids in a faith system? And I was like, no, because I wasn't raised that. But my dad's a very committed atheist. Now, my dad would say, like me, that Christianity has value. Every religion has value in the sense that it provides a moral structure for raising kids. So he'll go to church. And I was willing to go to church as an atheist. Because if my wife wants to go, and it doesn't have to be true for it to be useful. And so I went. First time walked into an evangelical church, sat down, listened to the pastor, and that day, for whatever reason, he made the statement that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And that provoked me to buy a Bible. So I bought my first Bible. It's sitting on the shelf back here. And I thought, I didn't spend a lot of money on it. I spent $6. It was a Pew Bible. And started to look at the Gospels, not really knowing what I was going to encounter. And right away, what piqued my interest was they don't match. The Gospels don't say the same thing. And in places, they say what appear to be contradictory things. So if I said to you, how many women rushed to the tomb to see Jesus? Well, depending on the Gospel, you might say, what, 2 or 3 or 1? Who knows? If you said how many angels are waiting at the tomb when the woman got there, you might say 1 or 2, depending on the Gospel. When you ask the question, what does the sign above Jesus's head on the cross say? You can read all 4 Gospels. They all say something slightly different. And nobody sought to harmonize those. No one etched that stuff out and made them all line up. That, to me, was interesting because I've been working with eyewitnesses for years. And eyewitnesses never, ever agree. And sometimes it's like you're scratching your head. How can they be so different? But in the end, as a detective, we puzzle these things together and we get the most robust picture of what happened on the day of the crime by basically bringing in all the details from all the allegedly contradictory eyewitnesses. So because I knew that eyewitnesses, if they're reliable, they're not going to agree. When I looked at the Gospels, I was like, maybe I should examine this because, man, if it's fiction, it should be lining up better than it is right now. And that is so typical of true eyewitnesses. So that's what started me.
Okay, interesting. Can you point to external sources of information that support the life and resurrection of Jesus?
Yes, as a matter of fact, now look, I'm going to drive you crazy with this, okay? So just be patient with me because my background before I became a cop is I was a designer. I have a bachelor's degree in design and a master's degree in architecture, which I call architorture. But anyway, that's my background. So if you ask me these kinds of questions, you're almost always going to get an answer that's visual, okay? So I want to show you something that I think you will find, but just be patient with me, I'll open it up. Yes, there are external non-Christian sources that can give us information about Jesus. I think you'd be shocked to see how many there are. So what I want to do is try to get this, let's see here. I think it'll be this, here we go. Let's see, I hope I'm doing this right. Give me 1 second. Yes, there's a bunch. And I'm going to show them to you just so you can kind of see how many there are. Now, when we're talking about the most ancient sources, remember that Christianity pops up in the empire, and it takes a while for anyone to even pay attention or notice it. So it takes a while for them to be even written Christian sources. So I think the Christian sources appear in the late 40s, early 50s. That's where I would date them. And so it takes a while even for Christian sources to pop up. But I want you to see how many non-Christian sources. And because this is such I almost got it. Wasn't sure what your questions were going to be, so I couldn't do this in advance. Okay, so here we go. What I want you to see, first of all, is the different
Ja, nu miste vi nok sambandet til USA.
Not the different Christian sources for this. Okay, so I'm almost got it. Come on now, Jim. My internet's fighting me here, so give me a second. Okay, I think I got my internet back yet, so now we should be good. Let's see. There it is. Okay, sorry. Now I've got it now. Okay, so I want to share with you, these are the gospel authors right here. So here's Jesus in the middle of the drawing, and here's a kind of a time clock of early time of Christian history. And these first four are your gospel authors, but they are followed by the students of these gospel authors. These gospel authors have students, and these students follow them and repeat what they were told. And then they tell. Now, this is the entire history leading up to the legalization of of Christianity in Rome. Okay? These are the Christian authors who can, now these first ones are just the people who sat at the feet of the eyewitnesses. So what's good about these is you could ask them, what did the eyewitnesses tell you? And their story had better match what's in the Gospels, and of course it does. Then, of course, they go on from there. Now, what I wanted you to see in that is just those are the Christian authors. The Christian, they had, for example, here are the students of the next set, and then you go on and on through history, and you'll see that each one of these contributes to the entire story until you have all of them in place. Okay? Now, what you might think is this is a game of telephone, right? Where it starts off and then one person tells a story and the story gets more and more distorted over time until finally by the time it gets to us in the Bible, it's so ridiculously distorted that you can't trust anything about it. But that, of course, is not what's happening here because each one of these guys goes back to the source material for his information. So you don't end up with this version of telephone. Now, let me come back to you for a second here and stop sharing that for a minute. I'm showing you that because those are the Christian sources. But it turns out that as many Christian sources we have for Christianity and the ideas of Christianity in the first 3 centuries of the Roman Empire, we have even more that are not Christian. We have all the non-canonical authors, number one. And you might think, well, the non-canonical authors are telling, a lot of them are Gnostic. They're telling slight lies about Jesus. They're later in history. They are not eyewitnesses. They are distorting the truth. But here's what they have to have before they can distort the truth. They have to have a common truth they can distort. And each one of those non-canonical authors distorts something that we can get back to as a core truth. And we can see what is the core truth that each non-canonical author distorts in some way. And you can reconstruct the story of Jesus just from the lies that were told about Jesus by people who liked Jesus, who are the non-canonical sects and belief systems that tried to capitalize on the Jesus story. But this is where it gets even, I think, far more interesting. And this will be a lot faster because I've already got it up here. I want to show you what the people who hated Jesus said about him. Because to me, that's what you're asking. Is there anything outside of the Gospels that I can look at? And I wanted to show it to you. Here it is. Hang on. I should have it here somewhere. Oh, for crying out loud. I'm not sure now if I got it queued. I'm not going to try to open another one. It turns out that in the first 300 years, there are so many non-Christian sources that say something about Jesus that if you destroyed every Christian document, including the Christian documents from the church fathers, get rid of them, and all you had were the writings of non-Christians who wrote about the Jesus story in the first 3 centuries, you could still reconstruct the entire Jesus story from virgin birth to resurrection and ascension from non-Christian authors. So I always say, well, if you had this idea that maybe somebody could destroy every New Testament on the planet in order to get rid of Christianity, you still wouldn't be able to get rid of it. Because even if you destroyed the non-canonicals, like from out of Egypt and different places in North Africa, you still have so many Roman sources in which they're complaining about a Christian, but they have to say something to complain about, and the thing they complain about gives you a piece of data about Jesus. If you just looked at the Jewish authors that did not like the Jesus story, and they complained it, they tried to falsify it. They would say, he's not working miracles by God, he's working miracles by Satan. Well, apparently he's working miracles, so we can add that back to the story. That's my point, is you can reconstruct the story of Jesus just from the complaints of non-Christians. And that to me was powerful.
The resurrection of Jesus, is that mentioned in other sources than the Christian sources?
earliest is Tacitus, where he mentions something interesting. He's talking about the burning of Rome by Nero. And he says that a abominable superstition, basically this evil superstition that was quelled, was stopped for the moment. The question is, what is this superstitious belief that Christians held that was quenched? I don't think it's that Jesus is God, because the pluralistic society of the Romans in the first century, they were willing to accept that you had gods, okay? That every culture they conquered had gods, and they would allow them kind of into the larger pantheon of gods. But I think this idea that the resurrection of Jesus is probably one of the best, most reasonable inferences. No one can be sure, and I can't be sure as well. But this idea that Christians believe that Jesus was God because he did something that demonstrated his deity is very clear. Even in those documents that are Roman documents, in which are maybe not even Roman documents, just early ancient documents describing Romans persecuting. It's clear that in those documents, the earliest Christians think that Jesus is more than a guy they're following. They're not following a Buddha. They're following something that they consider to be God incarnate. Well, what convinced them of this? I think the resurrection is as Paul writes early, it is the singular most important miracle ever worked by Jesus. And even though there may have been people who could do magic, we see this in the book of Acts. There were people who were not Christians who could perform magical acts. They could not rise from the dead. This is something that's unique to Jesus. And I think it's the best explanation for why Christians in the first century, second century, third century were willing to die rather than bend a knee to another god. They really believed that Jesus had done something to demonstrate that he was God. And that's clear in all the ancient documents.
Okay. So, another question. Is it possible to get a short explanation on why the Christians were not fooled?
Is it possible to look at a short
explanation on why the Christians were not fooled? Were the Christians fooled, or?
Okay, so if you're asking for the shortest explanation, let's do it this way. So basically, when people, I didn't talk about this as one of the explanations today, but it's on my list and it's in the video I sent you. And that's the idea that somebody is fooling them, or is either standing in for Jesus prior to the resurrection, or the crucifixion rather, or is standing in for, and most of the time people would say something like, well, look, Mary didn't recognize Jesus in the garden. She thought there was a gardener, and she thinks it's Jesus. Well, wouldn't she see right away wouldn't she recognize him? The people on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize Jesus. Why is it that Jesus looks different suddenly after the resurrection? Maybe an imposter is standing in for him. The problem is that all the stuff that Jesus does after the resurrection is every bit as supernatural as all the stuff that Jesus did prior. He's appearing miraculously in rooms. He is performing miracles like the catch of the fish or the encounter with the fisherman at the sea. He is ascending into heaven miraculously. Look, I'll tell you what, if all Jesus did was ascend into heaven miraculously. Forget about the resurrection. Let's just say he never was crucified, and at the end of his time with us, he ascended into heaven in front of witnesses. That would probably be enough for me, okay? If I was there in the first century, that would probably have been enough. So you're telling me that whoever is playing the role of Jesus seems to have all the power of Jesus, and that's the problem, I think, with the entire explanation. Not only that, I think in the end, it'd be hard for one person to pull that off. I think that's probably another conspiracy theory involving a group of people who can help you steal the body, who can help you pull off all the miracles, who can help you do all that stuff, because I don't know that one person can do all that.
There's a question about your conversion to Christianity, the process you went through as an atheist, reading the Gospels. How did you react when you saw that Christianity is true?
Well, so there was a couple of steps in that for me. There was a point at which I believed that Christianity was true, but I didn't have belief in. I had belief that. The demons even have belief that, right, according to Scripture, and that doesn't even make them Christians. So there was a period of time there where I had gone through all the Gospels and I told Susie, my wife, that, hey, I think these are telling us the truth. It seemed to me that the most reasonable inference from the evidence of the Gospels, as I tested them, and I used a 4-part template. We didn't talk about that today. But there's 4 things we ask of witnesses when we examine them to see if they're reliable. I simply took that 4-part template and I applied it to the Gospel authors, and they were doing pretty well in terms of passing the template. So at some point I told my wife, I said, okay, I think this is telling us something true about Jesus. But I was only working in the Gospels. I really hadn't gone into the letters much at all. And I was staying in the Gospels for months, just studying the Gospels. I said to her, I said, but I don't understand what the gospel, like, why would Jesus have to die on a cross to begin with? That makes no sense to me. Because although I had investigated the Gospels, I still had not investigated the gospel. In other words, like, how are you saved? And also, I didn't think I had a need to be saved. A lot of cops are probably this way, right? Like, we're the good guys. We take bad guys to jail. And you know, we're the ones who have things squared away. You call us to come and solve your problems. I don't need anyone to come and solve my problems. That's honestly the view you start to kind of grows in you the more you do this work. And it's a dangerous view that will keep you from seeing truth. So it wasn't until I trusted the Gospels for what they said about Jesus that I was willing to look at what the Gospels said about me. And that's the change that moves you from belief that into belief in, is that at some point you got to ask yourself the question, are you really that guy who needs a savior, who is so far off the mark that whatever you were using to measure before is not a good measurement? The reality is that you're a much bigger mess than you ever thought you were. You're the natural man who does not care about God and has never sought God. And once you realize that's you, now you're open to hear the gospel. And that's very different than that first stage, which for me was like, oh, this looks like it checks out okay. Well, no, now I'm at a point where I'm like, wow. Once you realize your need for the grace of God, it changes everything. As I often say, that the most unforgiving people that I ever meet are the people who think they have nothing to be forgiven for. Once you realize that you have something you need forgiven, you're far more gracious with others. It turns out the grace of God, if you understand it, makes you more gracious. And that's, I think, the biggest change.
Yeah, that's good. A common answer I get when talking about the resurrection is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. How would you respond to that?
So the question becomes, well, what do you mean by extraordinary? Do you mean it needs to be robust, like a huge case? Or do you mean that it needs to be somehow extraordinary? You know, like the quality of it somehow. Look, let me tell you how rare. Even you might think in America murders occur all the time, and they do. But given the population size, they are incredibly rare. Given the population of America, they're even rarer on a global sense. Okay, these are incredibly rare events. Do I need extraordinary evidence of some nature? No, you know, we use really ordinary evidence to prove extraordinary cases because they are extraordinary. And I've had some that are so bizarre that kind of murder might be the only 2 or 3 ever in the history of our country. I worked a garrote murder. A garrote is a wire strangulation device. And this guy garroted a girl. And it was so rare, I couldn't find another similar crime in my state's history. And I have a big state, right? But now I couldn't find, that's how rare it was. Now I got this amazing, rare claim that this man, when there aren't a lot of murders in our state to begin with, compared to the number of people who live there, and there certainly aren't this kind of murder, this is a very rare claim I'm making here. Am I going to have to use rare, extraordinary? No, I'm going to use the same old, boring, ordinary evidence that I use to prove a theft, that I use to prove a larceny, or something that's much less than a murder. It just turns out that we use very ordinary evidence to prove even very extraordinary occurrences. And we do this all the time in criminal trials. I don't think there's a need here. Now, what you're saying, though, is the case ought to be robust. That's different. Now, I know I'm going to be talking to you, so I'm just going to, should not take long to pull. This is easier for me to pull up. I just want to show you how much evidence we're talking about. Because the reality is that this is what I had to go through. And I'll just pull up the first one here and show you. So this is the overall. Remember, I work cases that are cumulative cases. So my cases are all based on a body of evidence that points to the same bad guy. And I have no eyewitnesses. Cold cases are lame for a reason, okay? There was nobody who saw it back in the day. So that's why it went cold. There is no evidence, right, back in the day. It went cold for that reason. So what you're really doing is you're saying, okay, how do I make a case in which it's that bad with no witnesses? Well, we do it using a cumulative case approach. So I want to show you what that looks like here. Here's what it looks like for the case for Christianity. I'll put it on the chalkboard for you, and I will share this screen. And here's the screen share. So this is the cumulative case that I talk about in a book called Cold Case Christianity. I just want you to see it. It's built on four legs that are used to determine if a witness is trustworthy, is reliable. Four categories. Now you can see there's like 8 pieces of evidence that feed into each of these 4 categories. And this is a lot of material. When I teach this class at Biola University here in Southern California, it takes me 17 hours to teach this class, okay, as a professor. If you asked me, Jim, why are you a Christian? I have to say, well, do you have a couple hours or a couple of days? Because this is what's going to take. This is why I'm a Christian. There is no one thing. It is the robust case for Christianity. This is what it looks like. Now, you might say, well, gosh, that's an extraordinary amount of evidence. Well, maybe, but it's really just quite ordinary stuff. But it's the overall circumstantial cumulative case. And by the way, I did the same thing to prove God's existence before I could move off. See, here's my problem. I didn't believe the resurrection was reasonable, but I did believe as an atheist in Big Bang cosmology. In other words, that the entire universe leapt into existence based on the science from nothing. There was no space before there was space. There was no time before time, no matter before matter. Before all space, time, and matter, there is a cause outside of space, time, and matter that is responsible for the appearance of space, time, and matter. And this is what's called the standard cosmological argument amongst physicists, okay? This is what atheists generally believe. Now, there's other theories, multiverse theories, all kinds of other things. But the point is, there's string theories, there's other theories. But that is the standard cosmological model. I embraced it as an atheist. But that meant that I already agreed there was something powerful outside of space, time, and matter. The only question is that cause an impersonal force of physics, or is that cause a personal cause? If it's a personal cause, then I'm guessing the most amazing miracle in all of Scripture is not in the New Testament. It's not the resurrection. It's Genesis 1. Everything, all space, time, and matter, from nothing. And if I'm a being that can create everything from nothing, dude, I can walk on water, okay? That's small potatoes, all right? All the New Testament miracles become small and insignificant compared to that one. So I realized at some point, wow, if I hold that to be true and I'm just wrong about the cause, that it's personal instead of impersonal, now the door opens up to everything in the New Testament. And that's what helped me to let down my bias against the supernatural.
Very interesting. So Ayur writes this: so the fact that Jesus rose from the dead is an explanatory possibility. But how about other religions like Islam, for example? How do they differ from Christianity?
Okay, so how they differ is that 4-part template I just showed you. So if you took that approach, were the witnesses really there, to see what they said they saw? In other words, how early can the documents be dated? 2, is there any corroborative evidence, even if it's just touch point corroboration, internally or externally, that can support the case? 3, has the document changed over time? Has the story changed over time? Or have they been honest and consistent and accurate over time? And 4, do they possess a bias that would cause them to lie? And there are only 3 biases, only 3 reasons why anyone lies. Only 3 reasons why anyone commits a murder. That's the template I applied not only to Christianity, but I had family. We're all atheists in our family, except my stepmother is Mormon. And I've got 6 half-brothers and sisters that were raised Mormon. So I applied this to the Book of Mormon because that's a claim that can be tested the same way this can be tested. But Islam is also a claim. So in my class, students will take that 4-part template and they will apply it to Islam, apply it to Buddhism, apply it to Mormonism, because these are historically grounded, well, not so much Buddhism, but at least Islam and Mormonism are historically grounded theistic systems. In other words, they make a claim about history. They can be tested. And if you do that, none of these systems will pass the test, except for Christianity.
Okay. How do you explain the disciples and others not recognizing the resurrected Jesus right away? Why did they doubt?
Well, I think that it's first of all, it's undeniable that they did not recognize him. And this is what Paul describes as the difference. There's something about the resurrection body, and this makes sense if you think about it. For some reason, Christianity teaches that we will not just become spirits and be united with God forever in a spiritual realm. No, we are going to be resurrected. We're going to be unified back to a resurrection body. In other words, the physical body, there's something about it. Now, I suspect that there is something that God wants for us that really is experienced physically, that we enjoy in this life, like tasting and touching things that you could not do without your physical senses, that God wants for us in the next life. Interestingly, in this generation of Gen Z believers, people who are in high school, younger believers, they report to be more lonely than any other generation in the history of humans. Yet they have more access to their friends online on digital platforms than anyone's ever had. How can this be? How can you have more instantaneous access to your friends? It's not physical access. It's almost like it's immaterial access. It's video access. And you have been designed by God with a body which matters to God, because he even gives you a new one in the future that allows you to experience these things you cannot experience without that physical body. And that's why when you're not in someone's physical presence, all the video in the world does not equal that. Because you have the Bible explains the world the way it really is. Now, what's interesting about that is, I would expect that somehow, if I didn't know anything about Scripture, I'm guessing that if I die in a car accident, I'm not going to be given as a resurrection body my broken, bloody last moment of my body when it was destroyed in a car accident. And if I make it to 99, am I going to have a 99-year-old body? I'd rather die when I'm 30 then, right? So I have a 30-year-old body. In other words, I would expect, just using my reasoning skills, that our resurrection body would be somehow different than the last body we saw. And then, sure enough, this is what happens to Jesus. And I would assume that even if I didn't know the Jesus story, if I was just told you're going to have another body, I'm thinking, well, it's not going to be this body, right? It's going to be something else, I hope. And Paul tells us that it's as different as the seed is to the grown plant. You cannot imagine one from the other. And then we see this in the person of Jesus when he comes back to visit. So I would say that there's something about that next resurrection body which makes sense to me, just looking at it from a reasoning perspective, that we will not have exactly what we leave with. And Jesus didn't either.
Good. One question here. What do you say to them who say that Jesus' resurrection is symbolical and not physical?
Well, right. Okay, so there's interesting, like, when I see, isn't it interesting that in the Gospels, not everything is described? And if you compare the number of verses in Mark's Gospel, it is woefully deficient compared to, say, Matthew's Gospel. Mark's not describing as much as Matthew. John is not describing as much as Matthew. I mean, why not? Why wouldn't you describe more? John says, hey, I could write a lot more about this, but man, I'd be filling up all the books and all the shelves that are available in the world. That's how much Jesus did here when he was here with us. So clearly, each author is picking what he thinks is important for his audience to hear, leaving out a bunch of stuff that he cannot include on every page. And everyone's perspective is slightly different, and their audience is slightly different. So you see them tailoring the message to their audience. Now, why I say that is because if you look at the post-resurrection appearances, I find it interesting that they would choose to describe those. And only those. There's a bunch that they're leaving out. Remember, it says in Acts chapter 1 that Jesus stayed with the disciples for 40 days following the resurrection and doing what? Giving them many additional proofs. Oh, really? Like, I want to hear what those were. Well, you don't get to hear what those were. Apparently, for whatever reason, the author didn't think it was important to you. He thought you got enough already. But interestingly, in the descriptions of post-resurrection appearances, Jesus does the things that you need a body to do. He eats with the disciples. He does things that demonstrate he's in the physical form. It's not a spiritual form. It's not a principle or a concept. He makes real life appearances and does real things, invites people to touch him. He invites Thomas to touch him. He eats with his disciples. He is doing things that demonstrate that, no, I'm back robustly. This is really me in my real body. This is really tangible. So I do believe in the physical resurrection, only because I find it interesting that of all the things that the authors could talk about, they include things that would infer that he is in a physical body, and actually in a resurrection body that is physical and touchable.
Yeah, exactly. One viewer writes this, people who have been very sick sometimes say that they were dead for a period of time. What's the difference between this and the death of Jesus?
Oh, okay. So what's the difference between Lazarus? I'm sorry, Lazarus and Jesus. Here you got somebody who Jesus, and there's several resurrections and healings that Jesus performs during his earthly ministry. What is the difference between those then? Well, because we know that those people, although they were resuscitated, although they were brought back to life, they died. They eventually died. All the people that Jesus healed and brought back from the dead, even Lazarus, he comes back from the dead, he's going to die. But Jesus doesn't do that. The ascension is important. It's different than, it's not like he rises from the grave. Then eventually Jesus died in old age in India, where he was teaching, in the East. I mean, some people will say the craziest things. But the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus is that Jesus doesn't die again. And that is the difference between these two things. And by the way, it's very different. This is why, you ever wonder why is it? Why is it that Jesus has to stay in the, why couldn't he come back to life while they were wrapping him? Well, there's a reason why he wanted to be in the grave that long, to demonstrate the impossibility of this being something like, I'm just unconscious, you just didn't know it. Or you resuscitated me and brought me back because I was still within that 6 minute margin, before brain death where I can. No, there was something that he did. Now, again, you could say the same is true for Lazarus, right? But I think the point I'm trying to make is those folks who Jesus healed or rose from the grave all eventually die. Jesus does not.
Okay. The principle of embarrassment is a principle used by historians.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on how it pertains to criticism and defense of the Gospels, and if it also is used in detective work? Was this a principle you used when you discovered that the resurrection was true?
No, it was not a principle I used. I'm familiar with it. The idea is that there are times when the disciples appear to be so ridiculously brain dead and they don't understand what it is that Jesus is talking about that it's embarrassing. And there are times when Peter does something embarrassing. I mean, a lot of times when Peter does something embarrassing. By the way, you'll find there's one gospel, and I did forensic statement analysis. Okay, so forensic statement analysis is this approach that we take when a suspect is asked to write out his account on the day of the murder. And then we assess his written document, written in ink, so he can't make any changes without us seeing it. And we assess that to see if he's lying. We're looking for deception indicators, and we're studying several different aspects of language that people use when they're lying. Now, the idea of the principle of embarrassment is that if this was just a concocted story, that it would have less embarrassing details about the disciples. And the fact that they are included, it makes them sound more true. Because, why would you include that if you didn't have to? If it didn't really happen, it makes you look stupid. Just don't leave it out. Just leave it out. Well, what I've discovered with bad guys, especially guys who are really good liars, is that they will include embarrassing details because they want this to sound like the truth. I'm just going to tell you, I've encountered, you meet all kinds of different people doing this work. And you meet people who maybe have never been questioned by a detective, But man, they're just good. I mean, they are really good liars. Now, you ask them questions that you already know the correct answer to. Now, I like to do that because I already know in front of a jury, okay, the correct answer is this. I can put it on the wall. Listen to what he says. And then he lies in such an imaginative way, including principles of embarrassment, that you're like going, okay, now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you know that's a lie because you know the truth and you heard what he said. So the next time he does something flowery like this, I want you to realize that's probably a lie too, because his lies sound really good. I just demonstrated how good his lie sounds. Now, so I've met guys like that. So I do think that there's an aspect of this in which you can say, yeah, the principle of embarrassment can take you a little way. It can take you just so far. But I personally, I'm such a skeptic. I'm so, to me, everyone's a liar until you prove otherwise. That I was not going to, you're not going to fool me that easily. And so I was not willing to, I wasn't going to buy it. Not that easily. So that's why I'm aware of it, and I know a lot of people who use it, but they've also never investigated liars. They've never talked to liars. They've never had to make a case on the back of a 4-hour interview that's been recorded with a really good liar. And I have to do that all the time. And I just have learned a lot about what liars can do. So, I mean, a lot of times people will write these books, right, where we'll say, we're writing a book using a title that makes it sound like you're putting on evidence for Jesus like you would go to trial. But most of the people who write those books have never been in a trial. And so I just know that sometimes people will offer these kinds of things, and they're good. They've got a limit. And for me, it's like, yeah, no, I've known guys who can lie and make it sound embarrassing enough to convince somebody who doesn't know better. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. It is a true technique that can be used. I just don't hang my hat on it.
Okay, interesting. We're drawing to a close now. One more question.
Sure.
So you think that Christianity spread because there were people who had seen the risen Jesus, they were transformed and spread the gospel, and Christianity grew. Then, well, some would say Christianity only grew because Christians were violent. That's how they were violent. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, so it turns out, if you know your history at all, that Christianity grew in an explosive way because somehow history had been aligned in preparation for Jesus. In other words, Jesus was not born in the Egyptian Empire or the Persian Empire or the Greek Empire. He arrives in the 1st century in the Roman Empire, an empire that had paved the way with technology, an empire that had provided 200 years of peace. From about the 30s in the BCs to about 180 in the 80s, 200 years of peace in which, in other words, world peace. They had conquered the known world at the time. They also had developed a technology and built roads that would take everyone who wanted to talk about Jesus all over the empire, and had even had a mail system in place that would actually help to communicate ideas. And between that peace, and they had a common language, the Etruscan alphabet they had taken, and the Greek language, and they had disseminated it across the empire. So now we had a much more stable common language and alphabet, a travel system, a postal service, and 200 years of peace in a culture that at least started off being relatively tolerant in the first 30 years, but then flipped on a dime under Nero, and the persecution of Christians began. What's interesting is the most explosive historic growth of Christianity does not occur in places where Christians are victors, where they are heavy-handed, where they are the ruling class. It occurs in places where they are the victims. So it occurs in Rome under several emperors in the first 300 years, who off and on decided they wanted to persecute Christians for one reason or another. Not everyone, but some. It occurs explosively in places like China, where it's being oppressed. It's under oppression that Christianity has historically grown, not like here in America, where 60% probably still would say they're Christians. Really, you get a passive form of cultural Christianity in those settings. Even though we might have the power or the social influence to convince people or to keep them in the system, you get apathy. And it's in places where people are saying you can't be a Christian, where Christianity thrives and studies and worships in spirit and truth in a way that it doesn't happen in those cultures where it's dominant. So I think just the opposite is true in terms of the history of Christian growth, especially in terms of maturity.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and Q&A. Thank you for being willing to give your precious time. I think we all enjoyed it very much, and well, all the best to you and your family.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ja, det var så til for i kveld. Og historikvaldene det har vært sammenhengende. Det har vist dere at kristne tryggven, hun kan vel være sånn. Så Lennox han viste dere at og jeg som tog om vi koronavirus og lojing, så er ateisme kanskje den nemmeste løsningen. Tog at man ser at det hendes nek ringt, nek folk er sjuk, og det er dødja, og det er nek lojing, at så kan han ikke gå god råd til. Lennox viste også at ateisme er ikke en god løsning. Tog at ateisme teker negativ fra oss som vi er gode i, men hun leser dere behalta lojingsene. Det gjør ateisme ikke vi. Så viste Lennox også at selv om det ikke finnes noe einfalt svar på denne spurningen om god og lojing, så helt han allike at han er koronatøyen. Han har vist dere at god til, og han er gode. Og tog endrer han bøkene, sier hver er god i en heim i koronaviruset. Han endrer bøkene og sier at selv om det ikke blir samfunnet om at god er til, at kristne trykken er sann, så vågner han at man vil granske det sin nærre. Kan det til sin nærre til vi snir Jesus Nazaret, hvor han var. Og det gjør vi så sørste mann kveld vi Peter J. Williams, tar han hei om evangelien og aldande. Det her vi leser om Jesu deg og uppreisnin, tjattene og i kristne trønne. Tok du etter, det overhør aldande frasagner. Og vi kom nok til at det ser ut til at det er rettelig aldande. Men så det til vi uppreisnin. Det er at det er ganske affære for lengt. Vi vita at de folk til ryser ikke opp. Tog fikk vi J. Wallace at vi gjør en kveld. Og brød fra hos han som ateister, fyrvandige ateister, og dropsdetektiver kom til trykk av opprørsene, at det var lise evangeliene nær ved detektivbrillene. Og i kveld må vi kanskje stedfeste at om vi skulle takke prøvtilfære for fullt, som han har vursak under sin drøy kveld, så det kanskje bare en sannlyk fra grøying, og det at Jesus røyser fra deg. Og det er mest så at så finnes det en god. Og det er mest at vi kunne lese om han i evangelien og sutja her hva det er velja mest av hver menneske. Her er nekker djupere sannlegger om hva det er at liva som et frats menneske i mening og liv nå. Om to kanskje er ferdig at huksa Møyra, om det står spurningar om liv nå, hos 3 kveldene, og du kan huske det videre Møyra, så er så velkommen at kontakte oss. Du kan sende en båt til KFS Fyrilestur av Facebook, eller at du kan skrive en teltepost til kfs.kfs.fo, og så kommer vi samskifte og gjøre herfra. Dette var det sørste, og vi får nå at det kommer en tøyner fra videre at etter møte hese 3 kveldene, og huske hva kan gjøres bedre i øvelse, og en ærfer om det her vedrør. Og om de tar akkurat rusler oss, eller akkurat hos går til dere, så er det velkommen at sende en båt til dere av KFS Fyrilestur Facebook, eller en teltepost til kfs.kfs.fo. Det finner dere også av hjemmesiden kfs.fo. Alle tiltøysene som vi da har haft, de er å finne av YouTube. De er litt av rasene av YouTube som KFS Fyrilestur hever. Og her kan du se ikke om etter et tiltøk noen. Og det kan også vise ørene som kanskje ikke kan hitte kveld, eller ikke se henne tiltøysene. Sånn at her kan det være. Og så skulle vi også lette seg Jim, han snakker om i mitt tilfelle som han at jeg viser dere. Vi må lykke å finne til å gjøre at det er telefonnummer her og lunchen her, men tenk om du fratter mer om inn i KFS Fyrilestur Facebook, eller kfs.fo. Etter det bare sier takk for å gjøre seg for, og velnående dam til tiltøysene til dere. Takk for det.